All right. Hi, everyone. Uh, it's now time for part two of the 45-45 League Season 12 end of season review. This time we're looking at the nominated Board 2 game. This is the game NARS versus OK, with OK being my fellow reviewer for this season. And last time I tried to record this, the audio quality was a bit suspicious, so I'm hoping that has improved since last time. Anyways, this game was played on June 14th, 2018, and let's get started. So white played e4, black played d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, and g6. So we had a Peerage defense, as they call it, which is obviously quite a hyper-modern opening in the sense that for the time being, black is refusing to occupy the center with his pawns, and he's relying more on sort of latent counterplay against white's center, generally involving the breaks c5 or e5, um, and or various counterplay measures on the queen side with b5. Here white played the move knight f3, which is not exactly the most ambitious move in the position. Like, if you're trying to refute black's opening, you generally want to involve your f-pawn to some capacity, like you either play f4 or f3 at some point, either grab space or support a future kingside attack, as well as support this pawn. Knight f3 obviously is a very popular move that's been played by lots and lots of strong players. To stereotype it, I guess white's mostly just trying to develop his pieces and hope that in the long run, his better control of the center will give him a slight advantage. Although white's interpretation of the line in this game was a little bit more ambitious than they normally play it. Black played bishop g7, as they almost always do, and here white played the move h3, which is not a move I'm all that familiar with. I know Roman Gingiashvili has advocated for it in a number of places. The move I'm more familiar with is bishop e2, which is a line I used to play with white. And also I had a couple games with black here as well. Generally both sides castle here. And in this sort of position, basically white has sort of developed normally, but he hasn't really done much to put pressure on black's position, besides occupy the center. And probably white's still got, I guess, a slight pull, but black tends to be hovering very close to equality. And there's many playable moves here. You can play c6, bishop g4, knight c6, a6, c5, even e6 or knight bd7 or b6 are all playable moves that tend to be fairly decent for black. So white instead went for h3. I guess the idea is, well, for one, to put the bishop on e3 without black being able to annoy it with knight g4. And in addition, white could be arguing that he hasn't committed his bishop to e2 so early, and maybe at some point it'll end up finding a better square on, that's the color I wanted, on d3 or maybe c4. As well, he's arguing that he didn't castle so quickly, so he still has the option open of going long, which he actually ended up doing in the game. And he also might be preparing future g4 push, which also occurred in the game. But obviously h3 can't really be the most critical move in the position, but it's a decent one. So black castled, white went bishop e3. And black played a move which looks a bit odd to me, but it's scored well in the databases, and it looks like a decent move. He played the move b6, and the idea is twofold. The most obvious idea is that black wants to put his bishop on b7 from where it targets white's central e4 pawn. But the second idea is that the b6 push supports the c5 break, which will assist in attacking white's other center pawn, which is, actually come to think of it, a relatively standard idea in these sorts of Peerage positions, playing b6 to put the bishop on b7 or a6, as well as support the c5 push. Sometimes they play c6, but white is meant to be a little better after that move. As far as I was aware, the cleanest sort of quote-unquote equalizer was supposed to be the move a6, generally preparing sort of a more active version of the b6 bishop b7 plan, where he goes b5 and bishop b7, and hints at playing b4 to destabilize this pawn. White generally plays a4 here, as he probably should to stop this. And here, black can play either knight c6, preparing the move e5, and if white goes d5, play knight b4, and argue that because white's got a4, he no longer has the option to chase this knight away with a3. As well as, you could also play the move b6, which looks somewhat similar to the game, but I guess black is arguing that the inclusion of the moves a6 and a4 favors him, because I guess the b4 square is a bit weaker, and also white's sort of dissuaded from ever castling long. But anyway, black played b6, which also looks like a decent idea to me. White played queen d2, which is maybe not a move I would commit to ahead of either bishop c4 or bishop d3, but it can't really be too bad. White's sort of telegraphing his intentions to castle queenside at some point by playing this move. Whereas developing the bishop might be a little more flexible with the king and with the queen, but also you do have to commit your bishop to a square, maybe earlier than you would have liked. Black played bishop b7, which is the obvious follow-up to his last move. And here, white played a move that looked a bit strange to me. If I had this position with white, I think probably I would play bishop d3 without really thinking, because this looks like a natural move to me, just covering the center pawn and preparing to castle queenside. And after black plays c5, which he probably would play, I think if you allow black to play c takes d4, he's probably got a decent version of a Sicilian, because bishop d3 and h3 aren't exactly terribly critical moves in a Sicilian, generally speaking. White should probably push past and go d5 and go for this Benoni structure, which is similar to what ended up happening in the game. Probably white's slightly better, but black has his ideas of playing like knight a6, knight c7, try to get in b5. And the e6 break is also available to him. Instead of doing that, white played the move d5 straight away, which admittedly does have the point of trying to lock out this bishop, but it also opens the other bishop diagonal, which I wouldn't be so keen to do without being provoked by c5. But this move has been played by some decent players. It just looks a bit odd to my eye. And I think the way to punish that would probably be to play c6 here, and just make this pawn break ASAP, take on d5, open the c file for the rook, and try to knock down this pawn chain. But black actually responded with the move, which also looks kind of odd to me. He played the move c5, which is probably, it's still okay for black. Like, black doesn't have a bad position after this move or anything. But it just feels like this is sort of justifying white's move d5, because in theory, it should now be harder for black to disrupt the pawn chain that's shutting out his bishop. In the game, it turned out that black had a few good opportunities to with e6 at the right moment, but at least in theory, this sort of makes white's task of maintaining his center a little bit easier. But okay, so we reached the Benoni structure, and white played a move which, when I was clicking through this game without an engine running, it looked like a fairly natural move to me, but it actually turns out to be a fairly serious mistake. I don't know about fairly, it turns out to be not the best move. He played the move g4, which, yeah, given that black has played sort of slowly with moves like b6 and bishop b7, you'd sort of expect that white might try to punish this by advancing on the king side. If he has time, he might play bishop h6, get rid of these bishops, play h5, and then try to just push forward. If you play h4, that weakens the g4 square, meaning the knight can hop into here to annoy this bishop. And also after h5, it's not so clear how white continues the attack. So g4 was played. Probably instead of this, white should make a more reserved move, like for example bishop e2, or the computer suggestion, which is actually the move I like best after thinking about it, bishop c4. Which it looked strange to put the bishop on this square where it's being blocked by this pawn, but the point is actually just to stop black's e6 break, which is sort of a key active idea for him in this position, as we'll see. But white played g4, which actually turns out to be a rather unfortunate weakening of this diagonal. Black played the move knight a6, which was, well, strategically, like in a vacuum, knight a6 is a fine move, but in this particular position, black has the opportunity to do something more direct. So that's move e6, which, in these sorts of Benoni structures, generally black's two important pawn pushes are b5, which you often try to get in with knight a6, knight c7, and a6, but white often has resources to stop it with a4. And the move e6, which is often, like in the modern Benoni, black plays e6 very, very early, is another key break at black's disposal. And black could play the move e6 here. And the point is, well, first of all, you're undermining this pawn chain. If d takes e6 is played, black goes knight takes e4. This bishop comes to life, the other bishop comes down this diagonal. If you take here, rook takes, this rook is open too. And this is just much, much better for black. It's much better for black. If you play long castles, supporting this pawn, maybe threatening to take on e6 and take on d6 at some stage. The problem with long castles is black actually has a tactic based on the weakening of this diagonal. It's the move knight takes e4, knight takes e4, takes d5, and if you play knight g3, the point is that black has d4, uncovering a bishop attack against this knight, and black regains his material with interest. If bishop g5, black has f6, keeping up the threats, and that's just extremely good for black. While, on the other hand, if you cover this long diagonal, if you try to cover this long diagonal with bishop g2, the problem is you then abandon the b5 square, abandon control of the b5 square to an extent, which means that black can then go for his other plan by playing e takes d5, e takes d5. This pawn, for the time being, is still fairly well defended, but now black has the move b5. Normally, it's more difficult than this to get this break in, but due to the weakness of this this d pawn, white currently can't take it, and black is coming with b4 next. This pawn, which was once quite strong, well, I guess this is the e pawn that came to d5, which was once quite strong, is now very, very weak, and black's better here as well. Probably white shouldn't play either d6 or long castles or bishop g2, or play something like, I think the computer was suggesting bishop c4, or bishop e2 maybe. But regardless, black can take on d5, play rook e8, and white not having castled yet is a problem. And even if he does castle, like, he still has to face the bishop on this diagonal b5 at some stage, even as a pawn sacrifice, and so on and so forth. So e6 would have been, I think, the best move. Both on pure tactical grounds, but also on general strategic grounds, in which if black plays slowly, there's a chance his queenside counterplay just isn't enough, and white crashes through on the king side. The old principle about you meet a wing attack with attack in the center doesn't always hold true, but in this case, it would have been a good idea, especially since white hasn't castled. Black played the move a6, which does have a clear plan in mind. Go knight c7 and push b5. Which, once again, like I said, standard idea in these positions, but there was something better for black in this case. And here white played a move that I'm not sure about. He played the move g5, which, yeah, I'm really not a fan of, to be honest. And there's a couple reasons why I'm not a fan of this move. First of all, on general grounds, I don't like the idea of, in these positions, pushing g5 before I've exchanged off the dark squared bishops with bishop h6, because we'll see in some of the lines we look at, black ends up being able to keep this bishop, and white's just not able to break through on the king side because this bishop is such a defensive monster, and also an attacking monster if white's king ever decides to castle queenside. Black played the move knight d7, which I understand, but actually the right move to play here, in my opinion, was the move knight h5, and the point is just that white doesn't have any way through with his attack. At least that's what black's arguing, because the natural follow-up to g5, which was h5, is now just blocked. And I would suppose the reason why black didn't play this is because he was worried about some sort of idea like knight c7, knight h2, knight c7, bishop e2, b5, bishop takes h5, and finger to this defensive knight. And yes, white's made black play g takes h5, but on the other hand, once you get over how ugly that capture looks, how does white actually continue his attack? I don't think there is a good way to continue white's attack. That comes in time before black plays e6, blasts open the center, and just has a great position. Because something like, for example, queen e2, b4, knight d1, even if you manage to get queen takes h5 in, it is still an open question how white continues his attack, because the h3 pawn is in the way of creating some sort of battery down the h-file. And here, yeah, black should probably play e6 and open the center. And the problem is black pieces are fairly well coordinated. Like, once this diagonal opens, this bishop will be excellent, this bishop will be excellent, a rook's coming to e8, this rook can perform various functions. And white's pieces have the feel that they're sort of scattered randomly. And I think black is already just seriously better here, because white's attack just isn't in time by the opening to get in before the opening of the center, and when it'll prove that white's king is actually the more unsafe of the two. If you were able to get in like queen takes h5, rook g1, knight g4, knight f6 or something, then maybe white would have something, but there's just no time to play all these moves with black already playing e6 and opening the center. You could also try f4, but this is probably met generally the same way, b4, knight back, e6, with a good position for black. Obviously, white didn't have to go for this plan of knight h2 and bishop e2 and bishop h5, which was obviously quite time-consuming, and it misplaced the knight on top of that. But basically, black's, I think, already better after knight h5, because, yeah, white's attack just doesn't have a way through. In the meantime, black can play knight c7, he can prepare b5, he can play e6 at some stage, and it's just good for black. But I can understand why OK didn't want to go for that sort of sideline his knight for the sake of blocking the attack and risking the bishop e2, bishop takes h5 thing. So we went knight d7. Maybe you could argue that if you are going to retreat the knight, it's slightly more accurate to play knight e8. I'm not sure how good an argument this is, but you can make the case that now if you play e6, the d6 pawn is a little bit better defended. And also maybe in some cases you can actually put this knight on c7, this knight on b4, and play e6, and then you've got both of your knights targeting the d5 point. But okay, knight d7 isn't really very clearly worse of a move than knight d7, but I think knight h5 is clearly the best move. White played h4, which I agree with. And here, I probably agree with it, I don't know. And here black played a move which to me looks slightly panicky. He played the move f5, which to me feels like a move you play when you're like, okay, if I sit, or if I go for my own counterplay on the queen side, I'll be mated by h5, h-file opens, and I'm just checkmated. But the problem with that line of reasoning is even if white, well, once white gets h5 and h takes g6 in, I don't think black's mated. And I'd like to illustrate that with the following variation. e6, black does have to take action, he can't just sit. But I think it makes more sense to make e6 as a pawn break than f5, because actually the problem with f5 is after g takes f6, there's a couple problems. First of all, white can now play bishop h6 once again and trade off the strong defensive and attacking piece. And also the g6 point is weakened, meaning that it's got the plan of playing h5, bishop somewhere, long castles, put a rook on g1, or you can do it quicker by putting this rook on g1, even quicker. And this pawn is very vulnerable because it's not defended by the f7 pawn anymore. e6 is probably more effective at creating counterplay, and also less weakening, because like if you do this, this pawn doesn't end up being weak because, well, if queen d6 right away, we take on f3, and otherwise, yeah, after bishop e2, let's see, what does the computer think black should play? Yeah, it just wants, well, at some point it wanted d5 right away. Anyways, yeah. So black went f5. No, wait. There was one more thing I wanted to show here. So if e6, white shouldn't take this. You shouldn't open the bishop and the rook without serious gain. So if you push forward, h5, knight c7. If e d5, white probably plays knight d5, which might not be something black wants. h5, knight c7, and here hg6. hg6, so the h-file is clean open, and if we were able to drop a queen on h7, it would be mate. But the problem is, one piece on the h-file isn't enough, and it takes a very long time to get a second piece of the h-file. And now that black's played moves like e6 and knight c7, the center is suddenly very volatile. So white doesn't have a million moves to waste on maneuvering his major pieces to the h-file. And here, the line I had, yeah, I just said castles e d5 and black was doing well. Because, yeah, this bishop has survived and it's very strong, b5, b4, upcoming, and it's dangerous for white. The problem is, even if you did somehow manage to get the queen to h2 and threaten queen h7 mate, that's still not even the end of the game. Like, assuming black's played rook e8 at some point, he can play knight f8, and with a knight on f8, there's no mate on h7, and the bishop does a good job of covering the rest. And this is sort of a general point. Like, in the Pirts and the Modern and the Dragon, if you don't manage to exchange black's dragon, Pierce, modern, bishop, whatever you want to call it. If you don't manage to exchange this piece off, it tends to be very, very difficult to give mate, as long as black's able to cover the h7 square. Which is why back here I'm sort of suspicious of this g5 move, even if knight h5 is not played. I don't like it so much. But that's just my opinion. So yeah, okay, e6 wasn't played. Black played f5, which I also don't especially like for the reasons I mentioned. So g takes f6, and here black played rook takes f6, which is a move I understand. I understand why rook takes f6 was played, but I still don't like it. Basically, black's idea, as he demonstrated on the next turn, is to play queen f8 and generate play down the f-file. But this play down the f-file doesn't really end up amounting to anything, because in the game, white ends up being slightly inconvenienced for a couple turns, and then after that, he's just free to move on. I think the best move, relatively speaking, would be knight takes f6, because, well, you're threatening maybe to at some point come to g4 to annoy this bishop, but also, when white plays h5, he at least has to acknowledge it's a pawn sacrifice. It's still a very good pawn sacrifice, but black's at least able to take a pawn and say, hey, if you don't mate me, I'm a pawn up. And this knight, yeah, there's better defensive functions. Rook takes f6, I think, is probably not, how do I put this? It's a move of, it's sort of misplaced optimism, I guess, because black's still going for attacking ideas, when really the consideration should be the knight on f6 is a decent defender. I need to get my pieces around where they can help defend the king. And also the other problem with rook takes f6 is later in the game it ends up playing bishop g5 and then bishop takes rook, which was also not fun for black. Bishop e2, queen f8. White is temporarily put on the defensive, so that's why I understand why black went for this. Probably queen f8 as well is maybe a slight mistake, and black should instead go for a move like knight c7. When, yeah, this is also not so good for black because h5 can be played. With the pretty simple idea of you go bishop h6, you trade off the bishops, you give mate. And the line I gave here was b5, h takes g6, h takes g6, bishop h6. If the queen comes in, and yeah, so I gave queen f8 just as an attempt to defend. But after bishop g7, queen g7, knight g5, black's in big trouble because, well, actually, probably the best case scenario for him would be white plays rook h7 and black gets the rook and the piece for the queen, which is still excellent for white. But white doesn't even have to cash in on that yet. Like, he has ideas of playing bishop g4 and knight e6, exploiting the light squares, even castling, putting the rook on g1, playing f4, f5. Black's situation is not good. But okay, after queen f8, they aren't really any better. White played the move rook h3, just defending the knight. That's probably a pretty good move. The computer wants to play knight g5, but did the computer want to play knight g5, or is that what I wanted to play? The computer, at least at first, wants to go knight g5 and put the knight on e6. But the problem, practically speaking, I think with this is it sort of lets the pressure off black a little easily. Like, he can take the rook, he can take the knight on e6, take and play something like knight e5. And yeah, black's an exchange down, but like this bishop's open, this knight's sort of come to life, the e6 pawn might be weak. And it sort of feels like white's cashed in a little bit early. And it feels like he's sort of selling his advantage a bit short by only getting exchange, and maybe black has some compensation. Computer likes material, so the computer wants to take the material, but I don't really want to allow that. By the way, if black doesn't take on e6 and allows takes g7, then the game's just over because the dark squares are too weak, the h-file is too weak. And if you end up having to retreat bishop h8, then that's pretty sad. But yeah, rook h3 was played, which makes sense. Black played the move knight c7. And white played long castles, which is a perfectly fine move, I think. What I was arguing in the notes that I wrote to this game was that, which I made a few days ago, and I'm now recording, so I'm referring to myself from a few days ago, as though it's a separate entity. white maybe should start with h5 before long castling, because long castling, I guess, gives black sort of a target for his various b5 advances and bishop shenaniganery. Maybe. Probably white should long castle at some point to get this rook involved in the game, so I'm not sure it's a huge deal. So white long castled and black played the move a6, which I think is a bit slow considering the circumstances, because once again, h5, h takes g6, even like rook g1 at h4, and then the other rook comes to g3, and you can't really sufficiently defend the pawn. There's another benefit of rook h3, by the way. Not only did it cover this, but it also allowed for white to double on the g file. I don't want to highlight that square. Target the newly weakened g6 pawn. Yeah, here a6 was a bit slow. I think black should, without preparation, go b5. At least this is what the computer was saying. You might have to sacrifice, like, you might be implying a pawn sacrifice with this move, because, like, knight b5, bishop b5, takes on f3, you have bishop d7. So white remains a pawn up, but I really don't think white should or would take its pawn. Because I mentioned earlier, knight g5, knight e6 was selling white's advantage short for an exchange. This is surely selling white's advantage short for a pawn. And it gives black counterplay down the b file in sort of Sicilian dragon style. So I don't think white should take on b5, but instead play probably just h5, b4, and just play knight b1. And black should probably try to mix it up with e6 takes, and then e takes d5, I guess. And white's still doing very well, but at least it's sort of a mess. There's some confusion being implicated. Which I guess is sort of why I don't want to allow like b5, b4, e6, e takes d5, which is maybe could be avoided by not castling so soon. But okay, castles a6, preparing to play b5, but that's a tempo slower now than it would have otherwise been. Because once again, I don't think black should, at this point in the game, fear sacrificing a b-pawn for sort of a relief to white's immediate kingside pressure, because some pieces get exchanged off, but also long-term play down the b file. White played h5, played b5, and white played rook g1. The aforementioned plan of targeting the d6 pawn. Also possible is to play knight h4 with a similar idea. And at b4, once again, just retreat the knight to b1. Rooks come to the g file if necessary. And it's already almost over, because black just doesn't have the resources to hold this together. Like queen f7, rook here. If you ever take on g5, I mean, you'll just get killed on the open g file. Like, you can play a setup like this, I suppose, but I have my doubts about this lasting very long, especially, like, here, black, I don't know. Let's say black does whatever, and it's white's turn again. Like, you can even play takes, and then followed by bishop h5. And white will break through sooner or later. Probably. So rook g1 was played. And here black played knight b6. Yeah. Which, once again, I don't know. This, again, feels a bit nonchalant, taking a knight away from the defensive role that it could have on the king side. Because I'm not immediately sure what this knight will do on b6. Like, I'm not sure where it's headed. Like, it could come to c4, and then white would take it, and then b takes. I guess now you've got the open b file, but there's not really time for that. So probably this is black's last chance to confuse the issue with b4 and e6. But even still, this doesn't really look like it's good enough for that much confusion anymore. We've got, I mean, this. And if black has to defend with that, that's pretty sad. And after ed5, yeah. It's not really in doubt that white's winning. But okay. Black played knight b6. And here white played a move I don't necessarily like. It makes sense in practice. White played bishop d5. Which is basically cashing in. White is going to take the exchange, and yeah. And once again, it feels like this is selling White's advantage a little bit short. The computer wants to go knight h4. Like, I understand wanting to take the material. Computer wants to play knight h4, which is hard to really dispute because it looks like g6 is just caving in, especially now that you no longer... It didn't really work, but you no longer even have the defense knight f8 to cover g6. So White probably even needs one less piece to take the g6 pawn. So this I think would have been more winning. Bishop g5 is still fairly winning, but Black at least has some counterplay. Especially since to take the exchange, you do have to give up your dark square bishop, meaning that this long diagonal dark square bishop is not only still on the board, but it's now unopposed. And Black manages to make some threats on the long diagonal. White dealt with them quite well, but this doesn't look like the cleanest way to win the game. Black plays rook f7. Then, yeah, the g6 point really is doomed now. hg6, hg6, knight h4. You take it, and yeah, Black's position falls apart. Therefore, yeah, Black, of course, gave the exchange, correctly so, with b4. Bishop takes f6. Could also play h takes g6. But okay, bishop takes f6. Queen takes f6, because if b takes c3, White has to move bishop takes c3. So queen takes f6, White has to move knight d1, covering b2. So White is an exchange up, but I don't know. I'm a little scared of this battery. Although the knight on d1 does perform good defensive functions. Speaking of being scared, Black now played knight a4. Let me promote this variation. Black played knight a4, and we got some stuff going on here. So White played kind of a bailout here, which makes perfect sense. But if White wanted to, he could. Well, okay, he played queen g5, which makes perfect sense to me. These threats are quite scary, so White just wants to swap the queens off the board. If you listen to the computer, the best way to play it is h takes g6. If h takes g6, just play rook h g3, just cold-blooded. And if b2, well, you just take on g6. And Black's threats aren't really in time. It's possible as well to play h6, keeping things closed and also stopping queen b5. And here, White plays rook h5. And after, if knight takes b2, the point is that you now have e5. Cutting the connection between these two pieces and the knight on b2. And White wins the game. But this implies like a level of being sure of yourself that isn't really needed. You can just play queen g5, and of course, if knight takes b2 is played, you take the queen, you take on b2, and you win. You're just a full rook up then, I think. So you swap the queens, then you play the exchange up ending. So, Black played h6, White played knight back to f3, Black played g5, finally closing up the king side. So White's kingside attacking ambitions, they could still continue with queens off the board, but now that the kingside's locked, they probably have to be at least placed on hold. White played d2, which I like, freeing the g4 square for the bishop and intending to come around to c4, where, yeah, we finally see another one of those strategic concepts in the Benoni structure. c4 tends to be a good square for the knight. It also frees up the rook along this rank. I played the move e6, which makes sense to me, trying to get some counterplay. Because this bishop, yeah, is still not doing so well. Takes e6, knight takes e6, bishop c4, with a pin. And here, black played the move d5, which I'm not sure I quite understand. Um, Computer says best is rook e8, and I think I agree. It's not terribly pleasant to sit in this pin, but there's not really any way for white to increase the pressure as far as I can tell. But d5 was played. White played e takes d5. And black played knight f4. It's possible that black thought he was just regaining his pawn like this, and he was freeing his position a little bit more, and just forgot that white can play d6 check. That seems plausible to me. Of course, it's also possible for white to play bishop takes d5 here. But okay, nothing wrong with e5, knight f4, and then d6 check. Black played king f8. White played rook e3, which I like. Black played the move knight b6. And here, white played c3. And I'm not sure I quite understand why he didn't play rook e7 here. Because, I don't know, the rook's pretty well placed on the 7th rank. And it kind of felt like d6, rook e3 were sort of gearing up to play rook e7. And I mean, if, well, the bishop's obviously attacked. If you play something like bishop's... Alright, well, let's say you take and then play like bishop f3. White has the pretty simple plan of putting the rook on e1, moving the other rook over, and bringing the other rook in. And this pawn is still quite dangerous, and if white manages to double on the 7th rank, then it's basically game over. And after, like, say bishop d5, if bishop d5, let's say knight b takes d5, white can actually, if he wants, just bring the other rook in with rook ge1, with the point being that if black takes this, then the d-pawn shows its force, and knight d4, knight d6 is coming next, and the pawn will probably queen. So this looks quite good for white. White decided to go c3 instead, which doesn't really spoil anything, but this looks a little inaccurate to me. And after knight bd5, which was played, sort of the problem with c3, I guess, is I'm not sure what happens if black just plays rook d8 with the intention of just rounding up this d-pawn. And yeah, here, for example, rook e7 is still playable, but after bishop d5, knight b takes d5, well, black's just going to take on d6 next. And then at least, like, he's leveled the pawn count. The pawn on h5 might fall at some point. Black's knights are decently active. White's still better, but possibly black has escaped from the territory of losing. And the rook e1 thing, yeah, you can't take, but you can probably still take on d6. So yeah, I'm not quite sure why black didn't just go for this pawn. And that's sort of a point of playing rook e7, is you end up sort of securing this pawn in a way, indirectly, because, like, well, it decides to take on c4 first, then the knight comes to a spot where it can defend it, and if you go bishop d5, once again, after takes, the knight can still end up on c4. And if you play bishop c6, then probably white just plays rook f7 check. So, yeah, c3, knight bd5 was played, bishop d5, and knight e4. And here, if black tries rook d8 anyways, white can grab on c5. And after rook d6, yeah, he's got the majority on the queen side, which should help quite a bit. And if black starts with bishop takes e4, rook takes e4, and then plays rook d8, white can't grab on b4 straight away because he gets his rook forked off. He can play, for example, king b1, but then black can play maybe a5, and then have time to take on d6, without making too great a concession. White's still better there, of course. Extra exchange does factor in, but that's maybe, you know, black's got some chances there. Possibly simplest is to just play king c2, moving out of the knight fork. So black takes on d6, white takes here, and yeah, the majority on the queen side does a lot of good. In general, black can take on h5, but the h-pawn takes quite a while to get going. It's very difficult to find support for this pawn, especially when you have to worry about covering the g5 pawn before you actually start pushing it. And so if black, for example, plays bc3 first and takes on d6, white can, if he wants, like, he can play knight e3, but probably it's simplest. You have the time to just play rook h1 and cover this pawn. And then play, for example, knight e3, rook c4. Now black's pawns on the queen side, specifically the c5 pawn, are fairly weak, and this knight can look into hopping into various squares as well. That's not the arrow I want to draw. And yeah, this also is pretty good for white. So black ended up playing c4 in the game. Not wanting to trade off this bishop, so he still has the two bishops. And at this point, white decided he didn't really want to play the exchange up position, maybe slightly vulnerable d-pawn, with black having the two bishops, maybe being able to take this pawn at some stage. So he decided to play c takes b4, which I think is probably a good decision as any, which implies giving back the exchange, because black does have now the move bishop d4. And if you move the rook along the rank, the knight hangs, whereas if you go back to e1, there's knight d3 check. But white just gives up the exchange with knight ec3, bishop takes e3, knight e3, which I think is a pretty good practical decision. Now white's just saying that he's going to play the ending two pawns up, where black doesn't have the bishop pair. And yeah, this is a technical win for white. And yeah, especially if you're in time trouble by this point, which I assume, well, from what I remember, at least white was, I think. Getting rid of a black's bishop pair is always a good idea. Black played knight d3 check, white played king d2. The bishop's still hanging, of course. You don't really have time to grab any of these pawns. Black played bishop f3. Going after this pawn, but actually this idea ends up being a bit mistaken. Probably black should instead retreat somewhere along this diagonal. But yeah, then like you aren't going to get this pawn really, unless you try bishop f7. But after bishop f7, white can play, for example, knight f5. And if black takes on h5, you know, worst case we grab the pawn on h6, and white's still doing pretty well. Now the g5 pawn is probably subsequently weak. Yeah, so black played bishop f3. White played knight takes c4. The white's now temporarily 3 pawns up. Black can't grab on f2 because of rook f1, so he decided to take on b4. And white went knight e5. And here, black decided to follow up on the bishop f3 idea by taking on h5, but this is a tactical mistake. I think you have to send the bishop back to b7, but obviously this isn't really what black signed up for when he went bishop f3. So he took on h5, and now white played move a3, and the quite nice point is revealed. The knight doesn't have any squares. Because these squares are all covered. So I ended up getting the d6 pawn for the piece, but white was at this point just a piece up. It's a little bit tricky because white has these double b pawns, for example. Black potentially could make some noise with the h pawn. But at the end of the day, an extra piece is an extra piece, and white, after some moving around, did eventually convert this into a win. Around about, yeah, here black ended up getting his pieces pinned, and that was enough to win the game for white. Yeah, so basically to sum up what happened in that game, both sides made some decisions I'm not 100% happy with in the opening, but I think the main culprit for the position that black got was this f5 move, which, for the reasons I mentioned, just leaves black's king side more vulnerable, and he should probably, well, he has to do something active, but should probably opt for the e6 break instead. While I would argue bishop g5 probably sells white's advantage a bit short, and white should instead go after the g6 pawn rather than sort of settling for the exchange and trading off your good dark square bishop. And white was an exchange up, and eventually he duly converted his material advantage into a win. Sort of instructive moment here where he decided to give the exchange to get rid of one of black's 2 bishops and just settle for a couple pawns up in an ending. which, yeah, is sort of a good lesson in not getting too attached to your rooks, I suppose. And yeah, white eventually trapped the knight, and then went on to win the game. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time. We've got one more review to go.